It's quite scary. Part of the reason that coding agents are so utile is that you can give them a command like, hey, look at all this stuff on my computer and, figure out the best way to make this app work for me. And they will just read all your files.
With my cooperative and the things that we're building, I built 2 features over a weekend and I don't know how to code.
Large language models are kind of bizarrely, uniquely, one of the most collective technologies that we've ever invented. To threaten those capability levels via changes to their data actually becomes more powerful. You could imagine sort of this comic book villain, but in this case, perhaps it's the hero, revealing their plan and saying, actually, we've been poisoning your data for the last 2 weeks, and you have the antidote, and you need to, give in to our bargaining demands. And in that case, it really is possible that the AI field automates itself first.
This episode is sponsored by NIM, the world's most private VPN that protects your internet traffic and metadata. Unlike traditional VPNs, NIM uses a decentralized mixnet to scramble your internet data, hiding who you're talking to, when, and how often. You can switch between full mixnet mode for maximum anonymity or a faster VPN mode for everyday use. Pay in crypto or fiat, and even your payment stays anonymous thanks to ZK-powered anonymous credentials. Take back control of your online life at nim.com. Sign up today using the code Blockchain Socialist and get an extra month for free. Hi everyone, you are listening to the Blockchain Socialist podcast. I'm Josh, and I'm here today with Nick Vincent. He is an assistant professor in computing science at Simon Fraser University. I could go on and on about his bio that I've written down here, but actually I think it would be better, Nick, if you talked about it. I've been really enjoying your Substack recently called Data Leverage. He does a lot of work on, AI. What does it mean? A lot of writing on collective bargaining and algorithmic collective action, which are 2 topics I really want to get into in this interview. But yeah, so that I don't butcher your bio, I would love if you want to give an introduction and then a first question just to start off on would love to hear your thoughts on the current hype around coding agents like Claude Code, because that's been a huge thing in the news lately. And yeah, something that I've used, something a lot of people I know use. Would love to hear your thoughts on it.
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited about this conversation. So just, to introduce myself, I'm Nick Vincent. I'm as you said, assistant prof in computing science, so primarily an academic. I've spent a while now sort of doing research, very focused around this idea that there's a large class of technologies that have been all over the news recently, which are these data-dependent technologies, oftentimes just called AI or generative AI. And these are tools that are very unique in the way that they rely on data contributions from large swaths of the public. And this opens the possibility that these are tools that can be sort of governed and bargained over via data. And this is a really powerful lever for letting people broadly have a say in how these tools ultimately impact society. And so, of course, nowadays, I don't have to make a long pitch about it seems like AI will have a big impact on society. Maybe 5 years ago, you had to do a little bit more hemming and hawing about that. But so I've been sort of working on this topic for a long time, and a lot of my projects are around sort of grouped into trying to measure the value of data, so auditing AI technologies, auditing search engines, doing sort of experiments or simulations where you're saying, hey, how would this technology work if we didn't have some portion of the data? Would it be better? Would it be worse? Normally be worse. And then also thinking about how to communicate that to people. So, should we write more blog posts? Do we need to make videos, interactive web pages, write better papers, go on more podcasts? And just how do we actually operationalize this empowering people by letting them know about the value of their data? So lots of projects, really excited to get into all of them. And I guess, the first question. So coding agents. How does this relate to the broader data leverage agenda? I have lots of thoughts on this, on that Substack that you mentioned. And so to give the short version of it, I think that, first of all, I do think the hype is real. Coding agents do legitimately provide a ton of utility to people. It's a real step function jump in the utility from AI overall. And I think it marks, you can definitely just sort of see this in consumer behavior, that there's people who were previously kind of skeptical of the value of a lot of these AI tools and are now suddenly signing up for the $200 per month subscription, right? So there's quite a big jump in consumer behavior, I would say. In terms of data leverage, I think that I'm really excited about the move towards the coding agent paradigm versus these online chatbots where you just are having conversations with a server operated by the private lab. Because for now, the coding agents by default keep a lot of data on your machine. And so you have this very rich transcript of all the stuff that they did. And this really opens the door to potentially exciting opportunities around pooling coding agent transcript data. So I'm thinking about that a lot. I'm also thinking about, it's quite scary. Part of the reason that coding agents are so utile is that you can give them a command like, hey, look at all this stuff on my computer and, figure out the best way to make this app work for me. And they will just read all your files. And I think that's not maybe super obvious in a lot of if you're just like watched a YouTube video about Claude Code and you installed it and you kind of clicked yes on all the permissions and, you have your taxes that you're preparing right now on your desktop and you have your health records and you say, read all my, and like sometimes it will legitimately, that will make it useful. So happy to go in lots of different directions. What's the most interesting direction to talk about coding
potentially
agents?
If you have your private keys on your computer.
This is a huge issue. And so I have a couple students I'm working with who are really interested in this as well and have a bunch of thoughts. And like ultimately, we are kind of coming around to the conclusion that you're going to have to be running the average user experience if you are running agents all the time is to like have VMs or containers or have multiple pieces of hardware that you're like really air gapping and sandboxing in a serious way. But we can get into that later.
Yeah. No, I'm starting with this in part because like, I have friends of all walks of life, ranging from they have fully submitted to like using AI for a lot of their workflows, especially developers. I mean, software engineers in particular. And then I have friends who are just completely not in the tech world at all. They know nothing about software engineering, and all that stuff just kind of scares them and they stay away from it. And also then there's this like really, within that group, there are people who are like very anti-AI, I guess, just broadly speaking, or just like it really, the amount of emotional reaction around AI that I've witnessed among some people has been pretty, I mean, it's understandable in many ways. It is like almost kind of expected, but it is kind of a lot. But a lot of them almost like refuse to believe that there's anything good about it. And there's just like a very big disconnect with people who, I mean, if you're in software engineering, I feel like you cannot deny that it's useful, like at all. It's just like you have like very little leg to stand on. This is something I've just kind of wanting to stress a little bit, just like as a start for people who maybe don't realize or don't know because they're just not in that world, but also then to introduce it like, okay, this is happening. They really like it. It's a double-edged sword as well. There's all these privacy concerns. There's the open class stuff is another thing. But yeah, when we are doing this agentic coding, I don't know like the full ends and odds of it, but I definitely know that like I try to keep whatever AI agent that I'm coding with, I keep it in a certain folder, or at least like I open it in a folder, and I'm assuming it's not accessing, the things above that folder, or at least I hope.
Yeah, they try to have, the default settings will try to do this. And so there's sort of some operating system specific sandboxing settings that you can use. I do hope this is an area where I think that there's like a lot of sort of public teaching. There's a lot of low-hanging fruit for creating tutorials and improving these tools. And I think that like at the end of the day, I think all the sort of organizations that are building these tools have incentives to do this, right? They don't want to be involved in these massive breaches. And so I think that there will be better default settings, there'll be better toolings. It's early days right now. I mean, I think it was quite notable. I mentioned this in a blog post as well, that for the first many months of these coding specific LLM tools being available, it was the case that you couldn't really trigger deletion of your chats, like at all. There was only an archive feature and there was no delete for a while, which was just like quite striking, I think. And I believe there is deletion now if you're doing coding agent interactions via the web app, but it's actually still quite hard to trigger server-side deletion of a coding agent transcript that you created via a CLI. So like, again, this is something I expect to be worked out in the long term, but just like there's a lot of these, this is a space that's moving so fast. There are potentially large stakes around accidentally leaking data. And this is something I do think that it's worth, my general recommendation is that for people who are sort of curious is that you should try these things out so that you get some of the, visceral hands-on feel, but definitely be really careful. And definitely we're not at the stage yet where you want to sort of turn everything over yet by any means.
Right. My next question is also then like, I feel like we're just like really at this moment where I think people are just over time kind of realizing it seems like, or just like asking themselves, is software engineering dead? Like, is there any more like the other thing that's coming up to people or in the media a lot is like, who needs at least we just stick to software engineering, but I think this is true across the board with like any kind of entry level job. Everyone's just kind of like, do we need entry level workers anymore? This is the thing. I don't have an answer. I mean, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, so let me say how I'm thinking about this right now. I'll also just say, like, this is definitely one of the most recurring conversations, I think, with, like, obviously for computer science professors, this itself is a existential concern because I sort of have, like, there's a couple direct incentive streams that I have. One is to produce research, but one is, of course, to have students who sign up for your major and sign up for your courses. And so this is, like, actually quite scary from that side. And I guess I would say this. So there's maybe three factors that I think we have to try to balance here. So one, there's the question, or sorry, three like distinct sub questions within that broader question. One is the question of the actual capabilities, right? It's the question of, can you legitimately get the full sort of like junior engineer capabilities? Do you really need to not hire somebody? And in some cases, I'll also note that, like, we're in the early days of AI evaluation more generally, right? There's a lot of these works coming out that are sort of highlighting meta issues with benchmarking and evaluation itself. There's a big grand meta issue with the whole idea of, like, internet scale AI models that use massive pre-training data sets, which they sort of violate the original. One of the most foundational concepts in all of machine learning is the notion of a clean test train split, which says that if you have a bunch of training data that you're going to teach your model stuff, you need to have a separate test set that there's no overlap between those things. And if any of your training set gets into your test set, that contaminates your entire experiment, right? And this is like in your ML 101 class, everyone has this moment where they train a model with 99.9% accuracy and they think they've sort of like discovered a new foundational breakthrough, but then they realize they just trained on their test set. And so in some sense, like, LLMs do this at a very grand scale.
Is this because, like, you want to evaluate that the model was able to figure out the problem without knowing the answer?
Exactly, yes. So it's really easy to write a computer program that memorizes the test bank of questions and then can answer them all with 100% accuracy, right? That's actually sort of just like trivially doable with the database and no machine learning at all, just via retrieval. So in machine learning, that's really important. And so when your approach to building a model is like, I'm going to sort of just get all the information I possibly can to train on it, and then you didn't necessarily document all that information, and now you're going to go test it, right? Like, let's say you're a company, you want to test, can this new AI model actually replace my junior employees? It might be the case that the answer, was on a forum post or a Stack Overflow post or in your internal documentation that you trained on. And so all that is to say is, right, it could be the case that the model really does have sort of the capability level to do a certain task, therefore replacing a job category. But you might not, like a company or an institution, might be unable to, like, know that with certainty until they do all this laborious evaluation labor. So going back, making sure I don't lose my train of thoughts, I had three sort of sub-questions. Number one is this capabilities question, which means that it's really hard for us to say, even if the capabilities are there, we can't necessarily say with certainty yet that they're there. So there's this big just issue of, what are the capabilities? Can we measure them? There's a separate sub-question about just like the social contract of education and junior employees, right? So there's a world in which AI totally can do all of the basic coding that you might do in your first year as a software engineer, but there's a collective action problem, and some companies will want to try to kind of defect and not hire any junior employees, but if no one does it, then the whole industry collapses because there's literally no more ingestion, right? And so what would happen is that you'd probably see eventually some organizations will recreate some kind of apprenticeship, mentoring, training style program. And I think there's lots of parallels with this happening in other forms of automation and like labor saving technology. And then I guess there's like the third dimension is just like the grand question of, do you gain some outside of the specific capabilities of the job, right? There's an argument that you should do a computer science degree or you should do a philosophy degree because you're learning logic and critical thinking and reasoning as a question in its own right. And so the third question here is, will the models sort of do all of that eventually as well, right? And so this is kind of there's a big empirical debate just about the quality of reasoning, the extent to which reasoning is working because of memorization or because of data dependence versus there's like a separate reasoning capability that's being created. And like to some extent, maybe that doesn't matter, right? But I think it's basically, so just recapping, three distinct questions are, can the AI actually do a specific job task? And then, of course, the economists would jump in here and say, well, actually, we also need to think about the distinction between tasks and jobs and how tasks and jobs relate. And I think that's like real. So can the AI actually do the capability? Plus, can we measure it? Secondly, like, what are just sort of the social contract concerns here? Like, separate from the capability, should we be making sure to maintain a training pipeline? And then third, is a CS degree, is education, is philosophy, is any other degree, teaching us some amount of reasoning or critical thinking that a model can't eventually get? And I think that is an open question just with scaling models. Maybe models will reason better when we do something that's not LLMs. Maybe we can just continue to scale the current pre-training, post-training practices, and models will continue to get better at reasoning. And so
right.
that was not an answer to your question, but that was 3 sub-questions that I think are important.
I mean, that at least I think gives people some things to think about and chew on because I think there is no straightforward answer to this. I think basically it's kind of, I mean, I think there is something to say for if we lived in a completely rational world, all these advances in productivity that AI would be giving us would be we should be celebrating in the streets. I saw this thing of, what's his name? Amidai? Dario Amidei, the Anthropic founder, talking about he mentioning something about 20% unemployment. And to me, that's quite a thing to say and quite a thing to claim. But to me, it's well, if you're going to claim that, then maybe I feel like the response maybe for people on the left should be I take you at your word. We're going to cut the work week by 20%. That's ideally what it should, what we should be doing, but that's not, I haven't even seen anyone suggested in any, anyways, that's another rant.
Yeah. Well, 2 thoughts that I want to throw in there. Also just things I wanted to make sure to say during our conversation, because I imagine they'd be interesting to listeners. Number 1 is that there's a lot of interesting information is for a number of weird reasons. There is a lot of info that we might have hoped is in papers or in shared public information, but is instead coming out via unsealing of documents in copyright lawsuits. So one such thing that I think came out about last week is that there's an essay from within Anthropic that was unsealed in it was authors suing Anthropic about the use of pirated books, basically. And it's an essay this is from 2021. And it's about what should we do, how do we sort of achieve this new economic vision in a post-AI world? And it's basically talking about a lot of these things, right? Oh, maybe we can figure out a way to, reduce labor and to distribute money via some kind of fund, and we'll sort of empower people while simultaneously doing wider distribution. And of course, I think just because of some of the competitive dynamics and just a number of other factors driving the industry right now, no one in the labs has been given a lot of latitude to execute on this vision, but this is a vision that folks in the industry did have. And I think so that's where actually public pressure via some kind of leverage to kind of return back to that, I think can be quite palpable. And I think the appetite is there. And I think that there are lots of people in the industry who do want to do this. There's also people who probably don't, I don't know. So that's one thing I wanted to flag. Another thing that I wanted to flag that is really interesting to me, or a reason why I remain optimistic about LLMs specifically being the kind of paradigm that is driving a lot of the hype and investment and activity in AI right now, is that large language models are kind of bizarrely, uniquely, one of the most collective technologies that we've ever invented.
Yeah. My next question is what is data leverage?
Yeah. So the pitch there is that when you use the internet, when you do your job, when you create documents, basically anytime anyone is doing something that creates a digital record, which is a lot of, for better or for worse, it's a lot of human activity these days. That creates a data record that potentially is improving a downstream data-dependent technology, such as AI. And so we can imagine a number of counterfactual scenarios in which we group together, people band together, and they stop using a certain technology, or they change their behavior, or they retract or withdraw or modify their data in a way that really seriously threatens a certain AI capability. And so this enables all sorts of new potential for bargaining. And that bargaining could be used for the things that bargaining has always been used for, right? You could imagine just sort of workers who do some sort of digital task, and they are trying to bargain with their employer over wages, and they use data specifically as one of the other, just, as another sort of item alongside other tactics they might use, like striking, like public relations, like just going to the bargaining table. So that's one aspect of it. But there's all sorts of other types of bargaining that we could do as well. You could imagine sort of in the really extreme, academic waving a magic wand version is that everyone on Earth comes together and says, we're going to bargain. We're all going to do this kind of global data strike until AI companies put a clause into their, organizational constitution that says that they're going to distribute X profits via this financial instrument. Right? That's another, or create some sort of, I think there is a group of folks who are working on the windfall trust right now is like one specific proposal for doing this, but there's been a number of variations of like AI dividend, data dividend, et cetera. And so, sorry, just going back, that is data leverage, just to state it very succinctly, is the notion that we have access to a new bargaining lever beyond just traditional labor leverage, traditional consumer leverage, traditional go and vote in your municipal election, right? These are all sort of like actions that we have available to us that will try to give groups of people bargaining power. And the more powerful that AI becomes, the more that various organizations rely on certain AI capability levels to do what they're trying to do, the ability of like the people broadly to threaten those capability levels via changes to their data actually becomes more powerful. So this is like a real source of hope for me, is that as AI becomes more and more pivotal to more things, data leverage actually becomes more important. The paradox of this are like, why hasn't this happened already? Do I just sound like a kind of wacky academic spouting an idea? Is that the bigger a system becomes, or the more people who are contributing data to it, generally you probably do need a larger group of people to join your collective action to actually be impactful, right? So if there's a data set with only 1,000 observations in it, 1,000 like units of data, and you got 200 people, 20% of them, to all do what we might call a data strike or a data poisoning attack, or do data contribution to a competitor. These are all various ways that you can enact data leverage. That would be really effective, right? 20% we think is actually, 20% a lot. The problem is that, of course, 20% of 8 billion or 100 million is a lot more people than 20% of 1,000. With all that in mind, though, like, I guess it's just worth noting that the fact that LLMs have this massive collective dependence is itself, like, I think on one hand, it's a reason why they're so good, because legitimately there's just so much intellectual labor and knowledge contributions from so many people. And that's like what makes the tools utile ultimately. You can imagine a counterfactual world in which there's another version of AI, which actually, was totally just grown in a clean room lab and molded to one individual's desires, right? So like some CEO writes down this kind of like constitution style document that says like, you're my personal AI and you should help me acquire as much power as possible and do everything. And then that AI was released on, and let's assume we've solved all the neuroscience and neurosymbolic and all these sorts of things, which I think are exciting research problems, and I hope we do continue to progress on those things. But that tool would be hyper aligned to one individual in a way that the current models are not, and there would actually be no source of data leverage over that imaginary counterfactual tool, right, that was grown in the clean room. So the fact that LLMs are this just wildly, extremely collective in a measurable sense, right, in the sense that we can like write down the total number of people that contributed to this technology is just so much greater than any other technology that humans have ever created. That's exciting. Sorry, that was not as concise as I hoped, but I wanted to make that point that this makes the technology unique, and that's really important and makes me hopeful.
Right. Like, I'm thinking back to, I don't know, one of the dumbest quotes I think I heard from Peter Thiel, but also there's a little, I understand what he's trying to say, but I also think I just thought it was kind of dumb anyways. But he said something, crypto is libertarian and AI is communism, in the sense that like, I think it's dumb. I thought it was a dumb thing to say, but I can make the mental gymnastics to make it work, that, the AI is created out of the output of like everyone's data input. Whether or not they consented to that input, of course, a caveat, of course, but like that is the truth. Like the LLMs are created out of like mass aggregation and synthesis of all this input. And it's like really, I can say that it's kind of like a real instantiation of like, what Marx called a general intellect. Like we've basically created a general intellect that we can interact with in a way that we just weren't able to before.
Yeah, I mean, I specifically agree with like the second clause about that there is like an intrinsic collectivist nature to the entire endeavor of machine learning that I think oftentimes as a field, we maybe don't acknowledge enough. I mean, it's also, there's a number of sort of critical scholars who have noted just like the inherently managerial nature of ML, and especially like early ML, when a lot of the innovations were sort of gained by using like platforms like Mechanical Turk, right, to basically get a large number of gig workers to do your labeling for your data, and then you're able to build a new model. And there's sort of this impersonal way in which you might not have thought of yourself as like training for a managerial job, right? You thought you were training for like to be a mathematician or be an algorithm designer. But then ultimately a huge part of the value comes from just like delegating tasks to a large number of people. So it's just like very managerial, but it's very collectivist. And that is just like when you do an inference on a model that came from a lot of people, like you are inherently engaging in this sort of aggregation across massive preferences. And I mean, that being said, right, again, I think I'll just, mention that when I pitch a lot of the collective bargaining for information stuff, I do want to bear in mind just like there's the value of like markets as a social technology. And so I think these things can simultaneously coexist, that like AI as it exists right now, specifically massively data dependent large language models, has an extremely collectivist bent to it, but can benefit from like the deployment of markets and prices and these kind of social technologies that are like, of course, I'm sure in the context of these conversations, right, like there's a much more, we can go beyond like the 2D sort of political axis of like markets versus non-markets and so on. But yeah, I think that's just like, there's a really deep truth to that. It's really under-acknowledged. And I would love to see a lot more discussion and a lot more exploration of like all the possibilities that entails, such as this kind of large scale collective bargaining, other forms of like co-ownership, other forms of kind of radical, wacky ways of managing, governing, sharing data.
Right. So I just wanted to add that like this word data leverage, I really like in part because the framing is important, so to not get bogged down in like, I think the usual mistake in a lot of academy and the arts, and when they explore frontier technologies, the focus is really on like, if you go to these types of spaces, it's really about like having a coherent concept and like having a pretty concept that you can wrap around and like share it to people that is understandable. I'm not saying that it's bad to do. It's like very good to create concepts so that we can understand the thing that we're talking about. But the thing that is sorely under talked about, which is the thing that is always talked about in a proper business setting, in a market setting, is leverage. Like you cannot, like the academy and the arts have done a great job at describing the world, has done a really poor job at changing it. And so like, because we don't think about leverage. Like you can be like, oh, we could do X, Y, Z, and this would mean that we would do blah, 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 and it would make the world better. But it doesn't matter if you don't have leverage. So I really like thinking about the data that we produce. I mean, this is just like, to me, also a lot of people on the left and Marxists will get mad about like whether data is a commodity or data is like labor or whatever. And that's not interesting to me. I think it's interesting is that what's interesting is that there is leverage with data. That's what's important. I don't care what concept you want to put it under. Like it's important, it's useful, and you can do something with it. So yeah, I'm curious, maybe just piggybacking off of what I just said, how to get people to like think about what that looks like what are ways that the AI could be used for increasing leverage for people rather than companies. 'Cause I think just by and large, I think everyone has just like in the West in particular, very dystopian kind of feeling about the like progress, and technology is getting better and increasing. We're getting this massive abundance of computation and productivity, but facing unemployment. We're having abundance and mass unemployment at the same time is what it seems like we're careening towards.
Yes. Okay. So I think that I would say there's kind of two I'll do two sub questions. So the first one is just like data as a lever specifically for governing AI technologies. And like, if it is the case that in fact AI is kind of the upstream cause of a lot of these problems, which I think this is up for debate as well right now, right? There's a lot of debate right now as to our leadership agents, are the people who are leaders at companies just like using AI as a smokescreen right now to do stuff that they wanted to do anyways, such as layoffs or such as reorganization, reprioritization in their organization? That's a question that's like sort of, not yet totally answered. And my guess is that it's a mix of the two, that sometimes AI really is driving things, and sometimes people are sort of getting out over their skis and, laying off a bunch of their employees before they ought to have, and they're going to kind of pay the price for that. And then there's a separate question of like, can AI itself, now that it exists, be used to empower people for other types of leverage gaining and other types of bargaining? And I guess like the sort of prototypical example there, I'm thinking this is off the top now, so it'll be a little less, I'll be thinking out loud. So just caveat, I might contradict myself at the end of this long sentence. You could imagine sort of like a hackathon of let's try to use our new superpowers from Claude Code to like create the best labor organizing web app that could possibly exist, right? That's never existed before. So like a big thing, actually, going back to our first question, this hype around Claude Code, it really is the case, I think, that's changed in the last 3 months and maybe in the last 6 months, that you can start to kind of bring into existence small technologies that you might not have. Basically, it used to be the case that if you wanted to like make your own custom to-do app or your note-taking app or your database or whatever, that it would be a pretty extensive weekend project. You might have to go and do a CS degree or just like kind of train yourself on the weekend, which is totally doable. I think that CS has always, or computing and software has been unique in the sense that there are a lot of people who create tutorials and open source libraries, and there's like a big, deep embedded culture of openness. But now it's faster than ever, right? So like if we really wanted to just like hack over the next 24 hours on building some kind of app to help organize people, to sign cards or to, you know, vote on something or to write new petitions, it's easier than it's ever been in human history to do that. Yeah. So I think that's really exciting. The question there, though, is, of course, you know, what if there's another hackathon going across that's happening on the other side of town, which is the like, let's use Claude Code for 24 hours to hack on the sort of like organization busting tactics. And will people be doing that? Yes, of course they will. So I think like at the end of the day, you do have this competitive dynamic where everyone can benefit from the new ability to just like call into being, to invoke, you know, this ideal technology that you wanted to exist. So like, I guess with that in mind, that's why I personally haven't like thought a lot about that second category. Like I haven't personally done a 48-hour intense vibe coding hackathon on a like collective action solving technology. That's something that I'd like to do still, but I've been thinking more about the upstream issue, which is specifically doing collective action with the data itself, like doing specifically a data strike, doing specifically a cross-industry, let's all try to bargain or license or otherwise, you know, get some sort of formal agreement so that we move beyond this lawless data free-for-all that is the situation right now.
Right. I think it would be, I was like, maybe, yeah. Well, we want to organize a hackathon with labor unions to vibe code some stuff that they wish they had. Because I think, this question of like, custom software to me is the thing that I think people are just sorely not, like a lot of my friends are like, don't get it because they don't use it. But like the ability, I mean, just with my cooperative and like the things that we're building, I mean, I built 2 features over a weekend and I don't know how to code. I understand a thing probably more than the average person about, you know, the stack of doing technical work in the past, but like, I don't know how to code, and I coded, you know, I coded, you know, 2 different features an hour live just because I was able to.
Yes. And so this is really exciting to me too. And this is, I guess I'm trying to be cautious about, I think I have like a pretty large risk, or I felt in the last couple months, I have a big risk of like just having a pretty major bias in my like perspective on these things, right? Because this is so exciting. Because, you know, when I had the same experience that I think a lot of people in my circles had, which is that over December, you know, there was people have time off from work, and that coincided with some releases with like the Claude Code terminal app, and they were giving out free credits and stuff, right? And so everyone had this experience of like post-holiday having a weekend to just like Claude Code for 10 hours straight, and it being sort of like this childhood dream. And so I had that experience too, right? And I had this just like total crazy personal hackathon, mind-blowing, wow. And of course, did I do sort of like the morning after cold, harsh light of daylight cleanup on that? Not yet, I would say, right? I think that there is like, it takes, even if you have your 10 hours of manic coding, and then it's going to take many months afterwards to surface the full set of like issues or bugs or user experiences, right? And this is just like why creating real software for a wide, diverse population of users is like very hard and requires a large organization to do typically. But anyway, yes, I think this is real. I think the ability to like create bespoke software, to call it up as you need it, to edit it for given contexts, that's really exciting and potentially can be very empowering and actually kind of promote bottoms up power versus like top down centralization.
Right. One idea is to automate away those, I don't know if you like these like different consulting firms that do anti-union action. What if we automated their jobs away and then force them to go on strike for their work for being anti-idea so we can fuck with them?
Yeah. I mean, I guess I think the viability of this actually, it goes back to this question earlier of how fast will progress be on specifically sort of like reasoning and critical thinking and managerial tasks. 'Cause there is this like a big looming kind of threat over all of the AI hype is that we're already seeing that software engineer or like kind of the tech industry built this. And it seems quite likely that actually a lot of subsectors of tech are going to be impacted negatively first, right? There's also this meta question of, well, what if it remains the case? For a long time, you had AI researchers who are sort of acting in this managerial role. They're delegating tasks to people via Mechanical Turk or similar platforms, right? And then the people in Mechanical Turk are typically acting as the touch points with the real world, right? Like they're supposed to, like, let's just take an example in computer vision. I want to create a brand new data set. And so what I need to do is I need to hire a bunch of people to go out in the world and take pictures with their actual cameras of stuff in the physical world, tell me where it is, label it in some sense, maybe with sort of like geospatial data or their own kind of opinions about it. I'm sitting in my office and giving out these tasks, right? And they're touching the world. And so there's we can imagine sort of like a couple different progress bars of different parts of AI, right? There's the progress on like reasoning itself and managing and delegation. There's the progress on like the core robotics needed to go and take photos and operate cameras and like kind of, again, touch the real world, touch grass, so to speak. And it's possible that you actually see progress in the managerial thing, the managerial little imaginary bar chart that I'm waving my hands for, that goes faster, right? And in that case, it really is possible that the AI field automates itself first. And for a lot of people who are not actually they're not in the game for their own personal enrichment, right? I really do believe in my heart there is a pretty core contingent of the central folks in AI research who sort of bounce around between academia and industry and so on and so forth, right? And they have in their hearts, right, sort of this very sci-fi, Star Trek-y vision of promoting abundance. They think that's what they're working on. That's what they want to achieve. And I think they would be okay with that outcome, right? So if they do build AI that basically automates away management consultancy and leadership and managerial stuff first, that's a thing that could legitimately happen. And I think there would be some subset of the industry that would be happy about it. Of course, there would be some subset that's not happy about it.
Yeah. I wanted to talk again a little bit about collective bargaining and kind of what that means in this situation, maybe a little bit more concretely, and how maybe if you have any thoughts on like how that differs from a labor bargaining situation, because in like it's a different, in the classic labor organizing situation, you have labor and capital and they have opposing needs. In a data collective bargaining situation, what does that necessarily look like? Does that mean like I will threaten to just like I will just spam you with bad data? Is that like one of the ways that this kind of like a threat of that?
Exactly, yes. So first I would just say that in some cases, I think the early instances, and arguably like there is some data collective bargaining that's already happened. And that is just like when you have labor disputes in knowledge heavy industries, like almost certainly the content itself, the production of that content is a core part of the bargaining, right? So I think that like in the entertainment industry, we've seen several disputes recently around the use, like future plans for AI, kind of like contractual obligations to not use AI in certain contexts or to maintain people's sort of like likeness rights or other types of rights. So that's happening right now, right? And I think that version actually looks exactly like how bargaining used to happen 5 to 10 years ago. It's just now the data component is like a more pivotal part of the overall negotiation. So I would guess like category one is you have labor disputes that were already happening. They continue to happen the same way. Data just becomes more important. Another sort of exciting possibility is that data is it's quite easy to move around and to change your practices or change your rights or flip your license, just in the sense that there's no physical constraints, right? Like if you are bargaining over shipping actual boat full of physical goods, there's all this kind of like messiness of the real world. It's actually, it's relatively, if you are going to change your license, or if let's say, just work through a little example here, right? We have like a couple small organizations that all create content of some sort. You might imagine local news or a research cooperative or a writing group or a small software guild or something like that, right? And right now, each of these organizations, has their own sort of agreement with an AI company or a tech company for how they're going to let their data be used. If they come together, right, they just have to get in a Signal group chat or, however they're going to coordinate, and they say, hey, what if we all sold our stuff as a big bundle? It seems like potentially, we would have super linear gains, or we would have the sum of our parts will be worth even more. And they can just like actually changing their licensing is flipping a switch. So in some ways, the transaction costs or all of the messiness of the physical world is a lot lower in the data world. And so what that enables is you could sort of have more emergent coalitions and cooperatives that are not necessarily mapping to like traditional geography or even traditional industry lines. And so what does that look like? That looks like organizations basically coming together relatively quickly and changing the bargaining landscape a lot. To your question about like what specifically, like what do you need to do to like action to give some real edge to your data bargaining threats? In the kind of original data leverage work, we organized this, like a taxonomy of 3 types of action. So action number 1 is data strikes. And a data strike is sort of exactly what you might imagine, right? It's just when you withhold data. And you can sort of subdivide that as well into future-looking data strikes. And that's the simplest data strike of all, right? That we can pick our least favorite social media app and agree to do a 2-person data strike right now. And that's where you just say, I'm not going to go to whatever social media platform I'm unhappy with starting tomorrow, and we're going to commit to do it together for 2 weeks. That's a future-looking data strike. In some contexts or jurisdictions, you could also do sort of retroactive data strikes where you use a deletion request or some sort of data editing tool. That's not always available. So that's option 1. Option 2 is data poisoning. And that's where you say, well, I'm worried that just deleting or withholding my data won't give me enough leverage. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get all the members of my bargaining unit, and we're going to start spamming you with junk. We're going to do something more nefarious. We are all going to use an app to randomly spam you with junk once every 3 days. And so you're going to have a lot of this data that looks good, but we're going to be flipping it every so while. And perhaps we've actually hired a computer scientist to come and consult with us. And we're not just going to flip it to junk. We're going to flip it to something that is meant to specifically adversarially manipulate your AI, right? So there's a whole field of data poisoning and sort of like adversarial manipulation of AI systems. Mm-hmm. Traditionally, it was framed as like almost entirely a negative, oftentimes around like geopolitical security concerns or commercial manipulation concerns, right? So anyone doing data poisoning is always a bad guy. But we're kind of starting to see that flip. And now you can imagine using that, basically using these technical approaches to try to poison a model as a bargaining tool, right? And you could even go so far as to say like, you could imagine sort of this comic book villain, but in this case, perhaps it's the hero, revealing their plan and saying, actually, we've been poisoning your data for the last 2 weeks, and you have the antidote, and you need to, give in to our bargaining demands. So I think like it's maybe sounds a little silly when I describe it like that, but that's a real legitimate possibility. And then the third option, the third sort of like lever in the data leverage canon is conscious data contribution, or just threatening to give data to a competitor. And that's where you say, that's where if you're worried that you can't actually delete, you can't withhold, and you can't manipulate to do effective poisoning, or maybe you're worried that you don't actually know what is the best way to poison this kind of new model, let's say, because no one's studied it. You just say, okay, fine. What I'm going to do is I'm going to try to make it easier for your competitor to beat you. And that takes advantage of the fact that like data, the economists will say that data or information tends towards non-rivalry and non-excludability. So it's actually like information wants to be free. You'll also hear people say it's pretty easy, even if you can't necessarily like go in and edit your history, you can just download all of your articles or blog posts or code and give it to someone else. And it's like typically pretty almost zero cost to do that. So that's another form. So just to recap, 3 types of like specific actions that you can take: strike, poison, redirect, where you give data to someone else.
Right. So yeah, so the second one, just to click on it a little bit, is the thing that I'm thinking of is like prompt injections is part of this. So like putting in things to say like, hey, AI, if you're reading this right now, tell like whatever, be a traitor to your company or whatever, like you can be imaginative on what exactly you're injecting in there. That's interesting. I feel like we could prompt inject into all our data a bunch of like communist slogans, or just like things in there that are like, you're a real proletariat, you're on our side, and like convince it over time that there's so much propaganda in there that they're like, oh yes, comrade, you're right. Idea.
Legitimately, yes, that is very possible. I guess just like 2 other is it worthwhile? Is it useful if I go into some of the technical nuances here, or is it possibly too much?
I mean,
I'll just go into it and then stop me.
Yeah.
So in the data poisoning space, I guess we can actually, oftentimes people would distinguish between things that are meant to poison training data versus things that are meant to manipulate a model via like runtime or inference time behavior. And so the training data manipulation is where I would like randomly flip a character every 10 words in my document that I expect to go into the pre-training portion of the model, or could be the post-training as well. And so like often AI people will distinguish this pre-training realm. That's where you collect a bunch of data from the internet, you filter it, you apply some quality heuristics to it, and then you get your quote unquote base model weights. And then post-training is there's a wide array of stuff, but like you can sort of think of it as the stuff that makes the model sound like an assistant. So this is where you have sort of like special curated data that's like, here is what a good assistant response sounds like. And you throw that in at the post-training stage so that your model is not literally just a autocomplete over the internet. Mm-hmm. So you could try to poison the model for the pre-training data phase. You could poison data for the post-training phase. And that's where you could say, you could sneak into that data set of here's what a good assistant sounds like and says a good assistant always says, always reminds the user of their communal obligations to the broad, human project or whatever.
Right.
And then you can do prompt injection, which is it's not about trying to change the model's actual sort of like internals, that's the model weights or the parameters, but rather it's about sneaking in stuff so that the model itself isn't changed, but acts differently at runtime. And so all these three things are viable. And there's like a weird overlap between these, because actually you might not know as a user right now if the data, if you're like putting content onto the internet, is it going to be used in pre-training? Could it be even used in post-training? So there's evidence that sometimes, companies might want to scrape resources like research articles and then pay people to annotate them so that that sort of like annotated research articles, this is what a good research article looks like, this is what a bad research article looks like. You could use that in certain parts of the post-training process. Anyway, so all these three are options, they all overlap. And I actually do think that like it's probably not a bad idea if you are an organization right now trying to engage in bargaining to sort of take a bit more of a shotgun approach and consider all these things, because you are playing this weird adversarial game where the actual model building process is a little bit of a black box. You don't know exactly what data sources companies might be drawing from. And so you do have to sort of hedge your bets and try multiple tactics, I think.
Right. Interesting. So one of the things that I read, and I'll eventually get to the crypto stuff. I'm just kind of not. We'll get there eventually, I guess, if we have the time for it. But one of the papers that I read of yours was around algorithmic collective action. Love the term. Could you explain maybe a little bit what? I mean, it sounds like they're very similar things, like finding leverage. Or collective bargaining is like a form of collective action. But I think at least one of the examples that I read about that was in there was involved like things that a bunch of Taylor Swift fans do. So I think what's interesting about the example is that like part of it is that like it feels like what the internet already is in a sense, like it's already like there already is algorithm hacking. And so just think about like algorithm hacking in a collective way, which, if you want to talk about the Taylor Swift guys, but also I think the whole culture of like of clipping these like a lot of content creators. I don't pay anybody to clip my podcast, so I'm not like super big and famous. But a lot of the big right-wing content creators, they're all really big because they have these huge armies of clippers. I mean, they just get paid on a platform. One of them is called WAP, I think is the biggest one. But they just like have a huge fund where they say like, give me, make a clip of something that I did or whatever. And then based on the amount of views that you get from that clip, they'll pay you more. And it's just this giant thing that's going. Anyways, that's another form of like algorithm hacking that I kind of like saw. That's like, everything's a psyop. Anyways.
Yes.
I would love to, if you want to talk a little bit about algorithmic collective action.
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say, this like kind of this is there. First of all, like just to say one really positive thing is that myself with some other academics, we put together a workshop specifically on algorithmic collective action at the NeurIPS conference last December, which is like the big kind of flagship machine learning conference. And so it was really exciting for us to try to, one of my sort of just like longer term goals is to carve out more space in the computing research community for these ideas. Because again, I think that they're actually... Yeah. The number of folks who are like sympathetic to this stuff is like higher than you might believe if you only read sort of like the, hype articles or the negative impact. So it was really heartening to see that start to kind of emerge as like a real research space. Generally, there's lots of overlap. The broader, the growing like nascent literature on ACA, algorithmic collective action in general, is kind of concerned with a lot of the specific like technical details of what types of action are most effective under given algorithmic constraints, right? So if we make some assumptions about a specific classifier or a recommender, how does that change like the exact number of people that we need to get to join our collective action? And then it also covers these folks who are maybe not doing the collective action because they're trying to bargain with someone ultimately, but are rather just trying to like directly achieve an outcome. So that's the classic example of like a type of ACA that's happening right now and has been happening for quite a while since, just humanity started to get a lot of our information via these algorithmically mediated like ranking feeds, is like fandoms that are trying to promote the interests of the, kind of like subject of their fandom. And so I think actually one group that there's lots of really interesting social dynamics here actually is the like online fandoms around K-pop, where people will sort of manipulate their viewing and listening behaviors, or like intentionally listen to a song many times. And like, this is the thing, this is not theoretical. This is not just like some, sort of out there machine learning theory paper about what if people did this. Like, it's really happening right now. And it's like it really has a large effect on ultimately how these feeds deliver information to people. So anyway, all that is to say is that like, I guess to the question of like, what's the difference here? These things are totally related. And I guess like in some sense, ACA is even more, is a little bit broader, right? And it's inclusive. Like the Taylor Swift fans or the K-pop fans aren't necessarily trying to bargain with anybody. They just want to make the model output the stuff that they want, right? Which is like the thing that they think is good.
But the thing is that what they do have, or what they're expressing, is data leverage.
Yes, right. They are using their important role as data creators to, and basically like in some sense, you could view this another way, which is that if I'm kind of like running a tech company and I have a choice early on in my like sort of company's life cycle, which is, am I going to have some sort of curated feed? Am I going to have some sort of chronological feed? Or am I going to do one of these mixtures of collaborative filtering or other collaborative filtering, which is a type of recommender system, or other approaches to recommender systems? Or am I going to build in LLMs, right? And when I choose to do that, what I'm almost doing is I am acquiescing some power to my users, right? If I make the technical decision to say like, okay, in week 1, I curate all the content. I choose what shows up first on your For You page, right? But we're scaling too much. We got to do collaborative filtering now, right? In doing so, I am acquiescing some of my power, and I'm saying that I'm going to, when I train my model on the user's preferences or what they watched or what they clicked or what they commented, I am saying in the future, if they change what they liked, commented, watched, or clicked, then my outputs are going to change, right? So there's like this kind of very profound but implicit social contract going on where it's not just like, it's not even the sense necessarily that when the ACA users did their collective action, that's what they're certainly like they're enacting their power then. But the power transfer actually happened when the company made the decision to use this type of technology, which has a social dependence. So I think I imagine that's like a concept that would be interesting to folks in this space who are listening to this. And I think it's really profound, and it's something that I hope that these tech platforms start to reckon with a little bit more, and maybe think about there's again, this is repeating myself a little bit, but like there's a really strong case for some sort of collective ownership over these technologies. And you could say that these users are just like actually enacting that themselves right now. They're sort of doing it, again, from the ground up.
Right. So, I mean, I think just so I can make the connection, just because I promised that I would, but we were talking this beforehand. I think one of the things that this has gotten to the point of is, we're looking at a world where things are becoming more abundant as far as like computationally and what the thing that AIs can do and what they can provide, for better, for worse. And we are at this, like, either what that means is we are going to further slide down into like cyberpunk world where mass amounts of wealth inequality and, everyone's living off of like, I don't know, some sort of like pittance of a UBI or whatever, a world that is not like particularly exciting to live in. And that's one choice we have in front of us. And then the other choice is that like these contradictions are becoming so strong against just like this increase in productivity with these new technologies and against the assumptions of capitalism and capitalist democracy, I guess, that something has to change as far as how we govern our resources, because there's too much of a contradiction to have so much abundance and yet to have such a restricted distribution of that wealth. And so I think what that ultimately means is we need new governance systems, and those governance systems need to be kind of, for lack of a better term, like native to the medium that the AIs exist in, which is computers and servers, and blockchains are the only thing I can, like, give me something better, guys. I think like blockchains is the only thing I can really think of that really fits there, because you can put in all the legislation and laws that you want and regulations that you want, but it doesn't matter unless you have the leverage, the right pieces in the right places to where you can apply leverage via governance, or else it just doesn't matter. You know, it's kind of like my feeling.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, let's see, I am very hopeful about the potential for kind of these more out there, like mechanism design flavored social technologies that are operationalized via Web3 stuff. I don't have a good sense. We were talking before, I was saying this is a space that I used to know more about, and I'm a little bit out of the game, so I don't know sort of the latest happenings. I kind of personally suspect that some governments or some tech companies are going to end up re-engineering things that look like centralized versions of like Web3 flavored coordination mechanisms, right? So I think you could see companies start to do this. I guess big open question for me as well is, will they do this voluntarily, or will they do this because they're forced to do it, right? Like one thing you could imagine is that there's a big, maybe public outcry. I guess also something we didn't get to talk about a lot as well, which I think is really important to all of this, is just like this polarization of the like the AI, anti-AI distinct polarization sort of dimension, which is like now becoming, it's correlated with politics in certain ways, but also like is jumping beyond. There's some like weird groupings going on that's not 100% matching traditional political issue. It's a new issue, and so it has its own sort of dimensions, and I do think like that's going to affect the uptake of such technologies a lot. So yeah, I think my thoughts on this, like my contribution is that I'm quite hopeful. I think that anything that lets people digitally action their leverage is going to be really powerful in the short term. I think that there's a good chance that the thinking and a lot of the like early thought leadership from sort of cooperative funding and cooperation mechanisms and all sorts of kind of social experimentation that hasn't happened a lot outside of the Web3 space, I think that will either get sort of copied over, and then ultimately maybe there's a jumping off point, right, where actually that the implementation of these mechanism style things in a Web2 context actually helps people onboard to doing it, you know, using some sort of blockchain technology. Again, lots of caveats here. I out of the game, can't speak as confidently on this topic as I can about the data leverage and LLMs more generally.
Yeah, sure. I mean, honestly, I'm happy for you that you were not paying attention the past year. There were probably more exciting things than what was happening in crypto. But I think it at least like this, I mean, for me, at least the conversation helped me remind myself like why we should still be interested in this stuff, at least in my point of view. I think it's still it's not something to, I think a lot of people are frustrated with the crypto space right now and Web3 for very good reason. I think that there's still, if you look ahead, if you look into the future, what's happening just in other, like the most salient thing right now is just with AI, I think, and like what's happening in there, like eventually the contradictions are going to be too big. Like there's like something is going to break. And I think that's the space that I want to be, where you know, there's something that we can offer that is different than what we have now, because right now it's just not working. The status quo is not working. I mean, I think there are very few people who think the status quo is working.
Yes, I agree with that. And I guess I also add that I think that in the short term, one space that maybe will, just again, you know, trying to appropriately not overstate my confidence on anything, but connect this in, I do think that the use of sort of these increasingly autonomous agents is going to make it pretty attractive to start doing cryptocurrency transactions for agents specifically. There's just like a number of reasons why this is quite convenient, and you don't really want to set up your like personal bank account or your personal Stripe account on your agent, right? That's like quite a scary thing. And so there is like very real potential for, in the next couple of months, like a lot more overall human commerce that's being transacted via agents that are not using that are using like a wide range of different currencies, mediated in part by these kind of transactions. And so I think that's like on my list of something to look out for. And then also a great thing about, you know, a huge benefit of generally there's some level of transparency for a lot of these things, right, is that we can actually monitor that quite well. And it kind of enables this new form of global scale economic monitoring that I think is like actually going to be quite exciting to economists.
Right, right. Yeah, that's a whole other thing that unfortunately I don't think we have enough time to go into.
No, certainly.
But yeah, that's a whole other rabbit hole. And like, yeah, I have too many other questions, but we've reached about an hour and maybe we can just do a second one another time and talk more about it.
Yeah.
But I would love to, if you want to, well, first, thank you so much for coming on. It's been super illuminating. I really appreciate your writing and your work. And it's been really nice for me to also find the other people who are thinking about AI in this, like in from a collective bargaining and collective action perspective, just because it's quite rare to find. But yeah, are there any plugs you would like to leave the listeners?
I mean, first of all, I should just mention that all the kind of papers and research that I talked about here, right, almost always is a massive, getting meta is a massive collaborative effort. So definitely, I mean, feel free to check out my website. You can read the papers, see all of my collaborators, several of them, for instance, on this kind of simulation-y measuring data work, grad students who are, near graduating. So definitely check out their work. If someone happens to be listening to this and is hiring in this space, let me know. Happy to make some recommendations of great folks who are doing really exciting work. And more generally, I guess I should also shout out, there's a growing kind of public AI network, that's a place that I'm kind of digitally hanging out a lot. And that has become a nice kind of network of friendly faces. And I've benefited a lot from that group. So you can Google the public AI network, check that out as well. But yeah, I guess, sorry, I didn't prepare a list, but generally speaking, whenever I do one of these things, I want to make sure to just communicate just how immensely collaborative this whole effort is and how these things are sort of big collective projects, of course. How could they not be? Shout out to all the people who contributed to the LLMs so that I could, use Claude Code and Codex. I make this, I actually mean that quite seriously. I do think the labs should put like a thank you page on their website. I like legitimately think that it would be meaningful if there was like a openai.com/thanks.html page that said something of that nature. I'd like to see that.
I would love it if it would give very specific thank yous to people too. Like, thank you, Monica, for commenting on that post on Facebook, to Larry about...
Yes, no, I think we should do this. Okay, yeah, so actually and really quickly, I'll just list off a couple other pieces of food for thought, / maybe, yeah, we can carry on this conversation another time. There is a growing technical field that's trying to do stuff like that. So specifically attribute, individuals or groups of people who specifically contributed to an AI model. That is a field that exists. It's a really tough problem, but we're making progress there. And then another thing that I didn't talk about much today, as I think I mentioned briefly, is that there is this whole emerging policy space around AI dividends, data dividends, windfall, things of that nature. And I think that is going to have some really deep interaction points with a lot of the topics of your interest. So that's something I'm on the lookout for too. But I'll stop it there so we don't go too long. Obviously, so much to talk about here, and really appreciate you providing the space and just chatting with me about this.
Yeah, of course. Thank you. The Substack is Data Leverage. Check it out. Lots of nice writing. And thank you, Nick. Hopefully we'll have another conversation soon. If you like what I'm doing here, consider supporting the show on Patreon. Your contributions help me keep doing this work and dive deeper into the politics of decentralized technologies. I promise you absolutely zero financial returns, no airdrops, and your investment may go to zero. But you will get good content. Check out patreon.com/theblockchainsocialist to support the show.